Esther Adoh was 20 years old. She was a student at the University of Lagos. Esther studied biochemistry. This was a very difficult program at the university. Esther lived in a hostel on campus with her 3 best friends. Their names were Aisha, Chika, and Damalola. The 4 girls had become very close friends since starting at the university. They were almost like sisters. They supported and cared for each other a lot. They were very similar. All 4 girls came from poor families who did not have much money. For Esther, being able to go to university was a big privilege. She came from a poor village where most children could not get an education after primary school. Esther's parents were farmers who worked very hard every day just to have food on the table. But Esther's parents dreamed of a better life for their only daughter. They wanted her to get an education and have opportunities they never could. So they saved every little bit of money over many years to pay for Esther to go to university. Getting into the biochemistry program at the good University of Lagos was Esther's chance at an incredible future. She knew this could lead to her becoming a professional and earning a decent income. But Esther knew the road ahead would be very difficult. From a young age, Esther worked extremely hard at her studies. When other children went to play after school, Esther stayed inside reading and doing extra work. She tutored younger students, teaching them the importance of education. Esther was the perfect student, respectful, hardworking, smart, and humble. Her teachers loved her. When she finished secondary school, Esther got very high marks. This allowed her to be accepted into the biochemistry program at the University of Lagos. Esther's parents were extremely proud, but also very worried about the high cost. In the end, they had to take out a big loan, using their home as collateral, to pay for the first year. It was very difficult, but they made this sacrifice for their daughter's education. From her first day at university, Esther was determined to make the most of this opportunity. She worked extremely hard, spending all her free time studying her biochemistry books and notes. While her friends went out, Esther focused only on her studies. The 4 friends all came from poor backgrounds, which motivated them. But Esther seemed even more dedicated and driven than the others. She wanted to secure a great future for herself and her family. In the evenings, Esther could often be found alone, studying for hours on end. Esther was committed to being at the very top of her classes, no matter how hard she had to work. On this particular Wednesday in early November, she and her roommates had a late biochemistry night class from 8 to 10 p.m. As always, Esther took careful notes and asked questions. When class ended, Chika said with a yawn, "I can't wait to get back and sleep." "You all go ahead," Esther told them. "I need to stay longer and finish reviewing these chapters." Chika rolled her eyes jokingly. "Of course you do. What's new, Miss Overachiever?" The other girls laughed as they left. "I will leave the door unlocked for you. But don't stay out too late this time. You need rest too," Chika said. Esther smiled and returned to her notes as her friends departed. She took careful notes, fully concentrating. After a couple hours passed, Esther began feeling a chill. She shivered and pulled her sweater tighter, realizing her surroundings for the first time in a while. The bright overhead lights cast shadows across the empty room. All the other students had long gone, leaving Esther utterly alone. Esther felt uneasy as she looked out the window at the pitch-black night outside. What had been a sunset was now total darkness, with passing clouds covering the moon and stars. The darkness seemed endless and unsettling. With a sharp breath, Esther checked her watch. She was stunned to find it was already 2:15 a.m. How could she have lost track of time so completely? Oh no! How did it get so late? Esther gasped out loud. She immediately began shoving everything into her backpack in a rush. Esther couldn't believe she had been so irresponsible staying out alone this late. It was very reckless of her. As she swung her heavy backpack over her shoulder, Esther's heart began pounding faster with rising panic. She cautiously headed to the exit, peering out nervously before leaving the building. Outside, the campus looked completely different in the darkness than during the day. The buildings and trees looked like strange shapes lurking in the shadows. A scary ringing silence filled Esther's ears. Taking a deep breath, Esther focused on the paths to get back to her hostel as quickly as possible. She pulled her sweater tight and walked briskly, wanting the safety and security of her room and friends. But the farther she walked, the more unsettled Esther became. A feeling grew that something wasn't right and potential dangers could be lurking unseen. Despite scolding herself, Esther walked faster, glancing behind her constantly. That's when she thought she heard a faint sound in the distance, like murmuring voices or shouts coming from somewhere nearby. Esther immediately froze in her tracks. Her heart pounded as she strained her ears, trying to pinpoint where the noises were coming from. After several seconds of tense silence, she shook her head and kept walking quickly. Esther told herself she was just letting her imagination play tricks on her because of the darkness and shadows. Up ahead, Esther could see the area with the hostel buildings getting closer. She felt some relief knowing she would soon be surrounded by other students and not alone anymore on these isolated paths between academic buildings. But then a couple minutes later, she heard the sounds again, clearly raised male voices this time. They sounded aggressive and angry in tone, though Esther couldn't make out any words. Her entire body went rigid as fear wrapped around her chest. Slowly and carefully, Esther turned around to look over her shoulder in the direction of the noises. At first, she saw nothing in the darkness. But then two large figures emerged from between a couple buildings about 100 yards back. Esther's heart felt like it stopped as she watched the two big, hefty men who looked like construction workers appear and start moving in her direction. She immediately snapped her head forward and broke into a panicked run towards the hostel area. She ran as fast as she could, gripping her backpack tightly as the shouts from the men behind her grew louder. Tears filled Esther's eyes as she realized these men were chasing her. All she wanted was to make it to the safety and security of her room. Gasping for air, Esther risked a glance over her shoulder. To her horror, she saw the two massive men were now running and quickly closing the distance between them. They were yelling in vicious, angry tones. With a terrified whimper, Esther pushed herself to run even harder as the entrance finally came into view directly ahead. Her lungs were burning and heart pounding out of her chest. She clutched her backpack like a lifeline as her footsteps pounded desperately across the pavement. Just a few more yards and she would be there, she would be safe. Esther could see the doorway to the first dormitory up ahead. But then something terrible happened. As Esther ran, her ankle rolled badly on an uneven part of the ground. A shooting pain went through her entire leg. She could not stop her forward motion before falling down hard. The heavy books in Esther's backpack made her lose her balance completely. She hit the ground face first with a huge impact. She immediately bit her tongue and tasted blood mixing with dirt in her mouth. Esther's face and body scraped roughly across the pavement, cutting her skin. The hard fall knocked all the air out of her lungs, leaving her temporarily blinded and choking on clouds of dust. She gasped and coughed, blinking her stinging eyes rapidly. Behind her, the sounds of the men's running footsteps grew louder as they got closer. Esther could hear their angry shouts and heavy breathing as they closed in like hungry animals. With a burst of panic, Esther tried to get up off the ground to keep running away. But a searing hot pain shot through her left ankle, making her cry out. Looking down in horror, she saw it was bent at a sickening wrong angle and rapidly swelling up. There was no way she could put any weight on that foot or try to run anymore. Tears of pain and fear filled Esther's eyes as she realized she was trapped. Desperately, she lifted her head and opened her mouth to scream for help as loud as she could. Surely someone in those dormitory buildings just yards away would hear her screams and come help her. But before she could make a sound, a large rough hand clamped down over Esther's mouth from behind, muffling her cries. The hand violently smashed her head backwards against the pavement. A blazing agony exploded in the back of her skull. Esther's whole body went stiff with terror as she felt hot, alcoholic breath on her neck. The heavy, sweating body of one of the men pinned her arms down while the other towered over her, grinning evilly down at her. No matter how hard Esther thrashed, she could not dislodge the immense weight crushing her down. Her lungs burned like they would burst from panic and struggle. Black spots danced in her vision. Through the haze, Esther saw the second man yank off her backpack and toss it aside. Then his meaty hands locked around her throat, squeezing just tight enough to choke her breathing even more. As she stared up into the heartless eyes of her attackers, reality seemed to fracture around Esther. Muffled screaming sounds echoed in her ringing ears. In that moment, she felt more stark terror than she ever could have imagined possible. Despite being just steps from the dormitories, no one was coming to save Esther. She was completely alone and at the mercy of these vicious men posing as human beings. The last things she saw were the flashing lights as one of the men drew back a rock clutched in his fist. Then everything exploded into a mixture of blinding white and red as the rock smashed into the side of her skull. After that, Esther knew only darkness as it swallowed her down into unconsciousness, a blessing to escape her body and the horrors it endured. Some time later, Esther regained consciousness, immediately wishing she had not. As reality sank in, Esther felt panic's icy grip tightening around her. She had no idea how long she'd been unconscious or what else her attackers may have done to her defenseless body. She tried to call out for help, but her voice came out a barely audible rasp, far too faint to be heard from this isolated ditch beneath the campus. No one was coming to save her this time. Frightened tears stung the cuts on Esther's face as she realized she might be trapped here until bleeding out from her wounds or exposure. What would become of her? Esther's mind reeled, unable to comprehend how any human beings could commit such inhumanities against another person. Why had she been targeted and made to suffer this nightmare? As panic threatened to overwhelm her grasp on consciousness, Esther struggled to push those horrific flashes from her mind. She knew she needed to stay calm and lucid if she hoped to defy the odds and survive this ordeal. As the hours dragged on, Esther slipped in and out of consciousness. Her breathing grew more shallow and labored with the pain and blood loss. She shivered in the ditch, feeling herself growing weaker and weaker. Esther knew she was dying, slowly bleeding out alone in this cold, squalid place. Her body could only endure so much trauma before giving out completely. In her final fading moments of awareness, Esther thought about her family one last time. She remembered all the love and happiness they had shared over the years, despite their humble circumstances. Her parents had struggled so hard and made such immense sacrifices, pinning all their hopes on Esther's future. But now that bright future they had dreamed of for her was being forever extinguished here in this drainage ditch beneath the uncaring campus grounds. Tears rolled down Esther's cheeks as she realized how her senseless death would utterly devastate her loved ones. She tried to hold on for them, to keep fighting and breathing through the ever-intensifying waves of cold and exhaustion claiming her body. But it was no use. Esther felt herself rapidly fading away into the void. With her last exhaling breaths, she mouthed "I love you" to the loving faces of her family that appeared before her. Then finally, blessedly, the darkness fully enveloped Esther once more as she slipped away forever. The next day, 2 workers from the university were cleaning and fixing up the areas around the campus drainage ditches. Their names were Derek and Joseph. They had worked at the university for many years. As Derek and Joseph reached one of the bigger concrete drainage ditches, they stopped to take a break from the hot sun. Derek sat down on the edge of the ditch, tired. As the 2 workers rested, Joseph suddenly saw something in the ditch. "Hey, do you see that over there?" He pointed down into the shadows. At first, Derek didn't see anything except garbage and dirt. But then a pile of rags or clothes moved slightly. The workers stared in confusion. Just as they were about to ignore it, the pile seemed to move again with a faint moan. Joseph stood up, his face looking scared. "Oh God, I think that's a person down there." In seconds, both men scrambled down into the ditch. As they got closer, it was clearly the body of a young woman lying crumpled in blood. Up close, she looked beaten very badly. Every part of her skin was cut, bruised, and bleeding. She was barely recognizable. "Jesus, what could have happened to her?" Derek said in shock, frozen. "Call for help now," Joseph shouted. While Joseph called emergency services, Derek knelt down next to the injured woman. In less than 10 minutes, the sirens could be heard approaching. Teams of paramedics and police came rushing towards the ditch with medical kits and equipment. The paramedics quickly put an oxygen mask on the woman and secured her broken body to a backboard. As the severely injured woman was placed in an ambulance, a police officer approached Derek. "What can you tell me about how you found her and what happened?" the officer asked family. Derek sighed, feeling emotionally drained as he tried to explain the horrifying discovery and pointed to the dirty culvert. "We were just doing our job cleaning up this area, taking a break, when we saw something in the ditch. Looked like old rags until it moved a bit. That's when we realized, oh God." He choked up, unable to continue. The officer patted his shoulder. "Take your time. We'll get your full statement. Right now we need to get that young woman emergency medical care and find out who did this terrible thing to her." Over the next few hours, the area was thoroughly searched as a major crime scene. Police looked for clues, witnesses, and security footage while evidence was collected. It wasn't until evening that police were finally able to identify the badly beaten victim using her fingerprints. She was 20-year-old Esther Adoh, a student at the university studying biochemistry. As soon as Esther was identified, police went to notify her family of the horrific attack on their daughter. The screams of anguish could be heard echoing from their home late into the night as they learned what happened. As the investigation continued over the next days, the evidence showed this was not a random or accidental attack, but a purposefully brutal and vicious crime. The level of extreme violence inflicted on Esther made it disturbingly obvious. This was the work of deeply disturbed individuals acting without any human decency or control. Though Esther was alive in intensive care for now, doctors were unsure if she would survive her catastrophic injuries. As news of the tragedy spread, people everywhere felt saddened and horrified. But the biggest question remained. Who were the monsters that did this to Esther? And would they ever be caught before they could hurt someone else? After Esther Adoh's badly beaten body was found, the police worked very hard to investigate and solve this terrible crime. Catching who did this to Esther and making them pay became the most important mission. The detectives carefully looked at every piece of evidence from the crime scene. They collected things like dirt, pieces of clothing, hair, and blood to be studied closely in the laboratory. Anybody who might have been witnesses were questioned about anything unusual they saw or heard that night. Police also searched through security camera footage from all the nearby buildings. At the hospital, Esther was unconscious and badly injured, her young life hanging by a small thread. Doctors worked around the clock to treat her broken bones, bleeding in her brain, and other catastrophic injuries. Even if she somehow survived, Esther's recovery would be extremely difficult with potentially life-changing effects from the trauma. Esther's parents and family never left her bedside, holding her hand and praying desperately for her to live. Seeing their once vibrant daughter hanging on by a thread was agonizing. As the investigation continued, detectives were able to piece together what likely happened up until the attack. They determined Esther had still been on campus late that night, studying alone in one of the academic buildings. In the early morning hours, she was brutally assaulted while making her way back to her dormitory. Evidence showed Esther bravely tried running from her attackers before being struck down. With the timeline clearer, investigators knew their best chance was finding any security footage from cameras around campus showing suspicious people during that window of time. If they caught sight of potential suspects, it could crack the case wide open. After reviewing hours and hours of footage, finally one detective noticed two larger men heading in the direction Esther had been walking, just minutes before her attack. The video quality was poor, but the two hefty men clearly looked out of place and were avoiding being seen clearly on camera. Using timestamps, detectives traced backward to see where those two men had come from that night. By putting together footage from traffic cameras in that area, they tracked the path the suspicious strangers took on the campus grounds. More investigation and record searches revealed shocking news. The identities of the two men matched convicted violent criminals named Peter Oni and Adeola Joseph. They had long records of armed robbery, assault, and drug charges across multiple states. Mug shots of the large, muscular Peter and Adeola looked just like the figures from the campus footage. Detectives raced to locate any known family or friends who could provide leads on the wanted duo's current whereabouts. Finally, one of their criminal associates cracked during tough questioning and gave up the location where Peter and Adeola were hiding out, at a rundown motel on the edge of town. The police team quickly surrounded the motel before dawn and entered the criminal's room, capturing the pair attempting to flee out a window. As police dragged the handcuffed men out, they found critical evidence: Esther's backpack and shredded, blood-stained clothing stuffed under the mattress. There was now overwhelming proof that Peter Oni and Adeola Joseph were the ones who savagely attacked and attempted to murder Esther Adoh that night. Even with the case mounted against them, the remorseless men continued claiming their innocence during questioning. Police had strong evidence for charges not just of attempted murder, but assault, kidnapping, destroying evidence, and more. If Esther died from her injuries, it would become a case of first-degree murder. When they heard about the arrest, Esther's grief-stricken family felt relief that the attackers were in custody, but also rage over the extreme violence they inflicted on their beloved daughter. While a victory for the investigation, the battle was far from over for Esther's loved ones. Their cherished Esther remained trapped between life and death, her fate uncertain. For now, they simply stayed by her bedside, holding her hand and praying she still had the inner strength to fight on. After the arrest of the suspects Peter Oni and Adeola Joseph, the process to bring them to justice for attacking Esther Adoh was long and hard. The police and prosecutors worked very hard to build a strong legal case against the violent criminals. More evidence was collected, more witnesses were questioned, and more charges were added related to the brutal assault on Esther. Detectives checked everything carefully so there were no mistakes or ways for the defendants to avoid prosecution. Even with so much proof against them, Peter and Adeola kept claiming they were innocent and pleading not guilty. They seemed unwilling to take responsibility for their monstrous actions. As the court case proceeded, Esther's family stayed by her bedside in the hospital. While her vital signs were stable to some degree with doctors' help, she remained unconscious with shallow breathing assisted by machines. Later on, Esther gave up the ghost. Esther's family and friends was devastated. During court proceedings, Esther's parents made sure to be present every day, wanting their daughter to know they were there for her even if she couldn't sense it outwardly. The grief and heartache were deeply on their faces. But beneath the sour burned an even stronger anger and determination to face the men responsible for their child's suffering. Every time Peter and Adeola entered the courtroom in chains, they fixed them with painful glares. They unleashed all their rage and anguish in agonizing testimonies that left the courtroom stunned. After a lengthy, emotional trial, both men were convicted of Esther's murder, robbery and other charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the gallery, Esther's loved ones felt a wave of relief that justice had finally been served. Though grieving, Esther's parents became campus safety activists. They spoke out to raise awareness, hoping to spare others the unimaginable grief over their daughter's murder.